The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Widener Library's basement archives, casting long shadows across rows of forgotten boxes and abandoned research files. Professor Margaret Chen had walked these corridors for 37 years, but she had never seen anyone sitting cross-legged on the cold marble floor, reading from a leather-bound journal that should have been locked away in the restricted section. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The child couldn't have been older than 12, wearing a faded denim jacket over a striped shirt, dark hair falling across concentrated eyes that moved with the intensity of someone 3 times their age. What made Margaret stop wasn't just the child's presence in a place where even graduate students needed special permission to enter. It was the expression on the young face as those eyes scanned the yellowed pages. Recognition, understanding, the kind of look that meant someone had just found exactly what they'd been searching for, even if they hadn't known they were looking. The journal the child held contained the final research notes of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Harvard's most celebrated physicist until his mysterious disappearance in 1943. For 8 decades, scholars had tried to decipher Hartwell's last theoretical breakthrough, the mathematical proof that had consumed his final months before he vanished without explanation, leaving behind only scattered equations that seemed to describe something impossible. The greatest minds in theoretical physics had examined those pages. Nobel laureates had spent careers attempting to complete what Hartwell had started. The mystery had become legend, a puzzle so complex that some believed it might hold the key to understanding the fundamental nature of reality itself. Now a 12-year-old sat reading those same pages as if they were a bedtime story. Margaret Chen's footsteps echoed against the vaulted ceiling as she approached, her sensible shoes clicking a rhythm that had become as familiar as her heartbeat over decades of research. She cleared her throat softly, expecting the child to startle, to fumble an explanation about wandering away from a tour group or following parents into restricted areas. Instead, the young reader looked up with calm, curious eyes that held no trace of guilt or surprise. "Are you Dr. Chen?" The voice was clear, confident, with the slight rasp that came from someone who spent more time thinking than talking. "I've been hoping you'd come by. I think Dr. Hartwell was trying to tell us something that nobody's been listening to." Margaret blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. In her 3 decades as Harvard's leading researcher on theoretical mathematics, she had grown accustomed to being recognized by students and colleagues. But this child spoke her name with the easy familiarity of an old friend, despite the fact that Margaret was certain they had never met. More unsettling was the casual mention of Hartwell, as if the long-dead physicist was simply another colleague who might walk through the door at any moment. "I'm sorry, but this section of the library is restricted," Margaret said, falling back on institutional authority, even as her curiosity pushed against professional protocol. "Are you here with someone? A parent, perhaps, or a tour group?" The child closed the journal carefully, fingers tracing the worn leather cover with something approaching reverence. "I'm here because of this." The young voice carried a weight that didn't match the speaker's apparent age. "Because of what Dr. Hartwell discovered before he disappeared, because nobody's been asking the right questions about why he left." Margaret felt a familiar tingle at the base of her skull, the sensation that always preceded moments when her carefully ordered world was about to shift in unexpected directions. She had spent the better part of her career studying Hartwell's final equations, joining the long line of researchers who had attempted to decode his last theoretical breakthrough. The mathematical concepts were revolutionary, describing relationships between energy and consciousness that challenged every accepted principle of physics. But the work remained incomplete, cut short by Hartwell's inexplicable vanishing. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, settling onto a nearby chair with the careful movements of someone buying time to process an impossible situation. "Alex Rivera." The response came without hesitation, accompanied by a slight smile that suggested the child found something amusing about Margaret's obvious confusion. "I'm 12 years old. I live in Cambridge with my grandmother, and I've been reading Dr. Hartwell's journals for the past 3 months." Margaret's professional instincts warred with her personal curiosity. The journals Alex claimed to have been reading were kept under lock and key, accessible only to tenured faculty with specific research credentials. The security protocols alone should have made it impossible for a child to gain access to materials that had been studied by some of the most brilliant scientific minds of the past 8 decades. "Alex," Margaret said carefully, "those journals are in the restricted collection. They require special permission to access, and they're usually only made available to advanced researchers working on related projects." Alex's smile widened slightly, as if Margaret had just confirmed something expected. "I know. That's why I've been coming in through the service entrance near the heating system. The lock on the basement archive door hasn't worked properly since the renovation in 2018. Security only checks the main floors, not the sub-basement storage areas." The casual admission of what amounted to breaking and entering should have alarmed Margaret. Instead, she found herself impressed by the methodical approach Alex had taken to gaining access to restricted materials. More than impressed, intrigued, because the child's explanation revealed a level of planning and observation that spoke to genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere mischief. "Why Hartwell?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious now about what had drawn a 12-year-old to research that had confounded generations of trained physicists. "What made you interested in his work?" Alex opened the journal again, pages falling naturally to a section dense with mathematical notations that looked like abstract art to untrained eyes. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Because everyone's been trying to solve his equations as if they were describing something that doesn't exist yet. But what if he wasn't trying to invent something new? What if he was trying to explain something that already was?" Margaret leaned forward despite herself. In her years of Hartwell research, she had encountered every conceivable interpretation of his final work. Colleagues had proposed theories ranging from early quantum consciousness research to primitive attempts at unified field theory, but Alex's question suggested an entirely different approach, one that reframed the mystery in terms Margaret hadn't considered. "What do you mean by something that already was?" Alex's fingers traced a complex equation near the center of the page, following mathematical symbols with the easy familiarity of someone reading familiar text. "Look at the pattern here and here." Dr. Hartwell wasn't working forward from known principles to discover new ones. He was working backward from an observed phenomenon, trying to create mathematical language to describe something he'd already encountered. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The distinction Alex had drawn was subtle but potentially significant. Most theoretical physics began with mathematical models that predicted phenomena later confirmed through observation or experimentation. But some of the most revolutionary discoveries in scientific history had emerged from the opposite process. Researchers attempting to explain observed reality that didn't fit existing theoretical frameworks. "What kind of phenomenon?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge her understanding of both Hartwell's work and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. Alex closed the journal and stood, moving with the restless energy of someone whose mind operated faster than their physical surroundings could accommodate. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. But I think the answer isn't in his mathematical notes, I think it's in the places he went during his final months, the people he talked to, the experiments he conducted that aren't in any official records. Margaret's throat tightened. She had spent years researching Hartwell's final period, interviewing elderly colleagues who remembered his last semester, examining university records and personal correspondence. The picture that emerged was of a brilliant mind, pushed to the edge of exhaustion by work that consumed every waking moment. But Alex seemed to suggest there were aspects of Hartwell's final research that had escaped decades of scholarly investigation. Alex, many very intelligent people have studied Dr. Hartwell's last months, his colleagues, his students, even investigators who looked into his disappearance. What makes you think there are details they missed? The child's expression grew serious, losing the playful edge that had characterized their earlier conversation. Because they were all looking for scientific explanations. They assumed that a theoretical physicist would approach an unusual phenomenon through accepted academic channels, with proper documentation and peer review. But what if what Dr. Hartwell discovered was so far outside conventional understanding that normal academic processes couldn't handle it? Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Alex's suggestion implied that Hartwell's final research had ventured into territory that existed beyond the boundaries of established science, realms where traditional academic methodology might prove inadequate or even counterproductive. That's a very sophisticated way of thinking about scientific methodology for someone your age, Margaret observed, studying Alex's face for signs of the precocious intelligence that occasionally emerged in unusually gifted children. Alex shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than typical teenage nonchalance. My grandmother says I think about things differently than other kids. She used to work at MIT before she retired. She taught me that the most important discoveries usually happen when someone asks questions that everyone else thinks are too obvious or too impossible to bother with. Margaret's curiosity deepened. A grandmother with MIT credentials would explain Alex's familiarity with academic environments and sophisticated scientific thinking. But it didn't explain the child's apparent access to restricted materials or the uncanny insight into research that had puzzled experts for decades. What does your grandmother think about your interest in Dr. Hartwell's work? Alex's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. She doesn't know how deep I've gotten into it. She knows I'm interested in physics and mathematics, but she thinks I'm just reading general science books from the public library. I haven't told her about finding the journals or about what I think Dr. Hartwell actually discovered. Margaret recognized the familiar territory of a bright child operating beyond adult supervision, pursuing intellectual interests that parents and guardians might find concerning if fully understood. She had been such a child herself, spending countless hours in libraries and laboratories, following curiosities that led far from age-appropriate activities. Why haven't you told her? Alex sat back down, hugging knees against chest in a gesture that reminded Margaret of the child's actual age. Because what I think Dr. Hartwell found isn't something you can explain easily. It's not the kind of discovery that fits into normal categories. And because I think the reason he disappeared wasn't because he couldn't handle what he'd learned, but because he realized other people couldn't handle it either. Margaret felt her skepticism wavering under the weight of Alex's conviction. The child spoke with the certainty of someone who had arrived at conclusions through careful analysis rather than wild speculation. But the implications of what Alex seemed to be suggesting pushed against Margaret's professional understanding of both scientific methodology and historical fact. Alex, that's a very serious accusation. You're implying that Dr. Hartwell made a discovery so significant and so potentially dangerous that he chose to disappear rather than share it with the scientific community. Alex nodded slowly. I think he tried to share it. I think he spent his final months attempting to find colleagues who could understand what he'd learned and help him decide what to do with the knowledge. But I think everyone he approached either dismissed his claims as impossible or became too frightened by the implications to provide the support he needed. Margaret's mind raced through her knowledge of Hartwell's final period. The historical record showed increased isolation, colleagues noting his growing obsession with theoretical work that seemed disconnected from his previous research. Department meetings where his presentations became increasingly abstract and difficult to follow. A gradual withdrawal from university social functions and collaborative projects. The pattern Alex described fit the available evidence, but it suggested an interpretation that historians and scientists had been reluctant to consider. Rather than a brilliant mind succumbing to the pressure of impossible research, Alex proposed a brilliant mind grappling with a discovery too profound for its historical moment. What kind of discovery do you think he made? Alex opened the journal again, finding a page filled with diagrams that resembled architectural blueprints more than mathematical equations. I think he found a way to prove that consciousness isn't produced by the brain. I think he discovered that awareness itself is a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism, and that human minds are just one way that force manifests in physical reality. Margaret's breath caught. The implications of such a discovery would indeed have been revolutionary, challenging not just scientific understanding, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. In 1943, such claims would have been dismissed as philosophy rather than physics, relegated to speculation rather than serious academic consideration. That's a remarkable theory, Alex. But what evidence do you have that Dr. Hartwell was working in that direction? Alex flipped through several pages, pointing out recurring symbols and mathematical relationships that appeared throughout Hartwell's notes. Look at these equations. They're not describing particle interactions or energy transformations. They're describing information patterns that exist independently of physical systems. And here, in his personal notes, he writes about observer effects that can't be explained by quantum mechanics because they occur at scales where quantum effects shouldn't be relevant. Margaret leaned closer, studying the mathematical notations with growing amazement. Her expertise in theoretical mathematics allowed her to follow Hartwell's reasoning, and Alex's interpretation revealed patterns she had never noticed during her own research. The equations did indeed seem to describe information structures that operated according to principles unlike anything in accepted physics. How did you learn to read these equations? The mathematical concepts are extremely advanced, requiring graduate-level understanding of theoretical physics. Alex's expression became almost apologetic. I taught myself. Started with basic calculus when I was 9, moved through differential equations and linear algebra, then into quantum mechanics and relativity theory. My grandmother helped with some of the more difficult concepts, but mostly I just read textbooks and worked through problems until the mathematics started making sense. Margaret stared at the child, recalibrating her understanding of who she was dealing with. Self-taught. Mastery of advanced mathematics by age 12 was not unheard of, but it was rare enough to indicate exceptional intellectual capability. Combined with Alex's apparent insight into Hartwell's work, it suggested Margaret was encountering the kind of precocious genius that appeared perhaps once in a generation. Alex, what you're describing represents years of intensive study. Most students don't encounter these mathematical concepts until late undergraduate or graduate school. How have you managed to learn so much so quickly? Alex's shoulders moved in another shrug, but this one carried a hint of self-consciousness that reminded Margaret of the child's youth. I don't really know. Mathematics just makes sense to me, like a language I already spoke, but had to learn how to write. When I read Dr. Hartwell's equations, I can see what he was trying to say, even when the notation is incomplete, or when he was working through ideas that he hadn't fully developed yet. Margaret felt a familiar excitement building, the sensation that always preceded major breakthroughs in her research. But this time, the potential discovery wasn't her own. She was witnessing a young mind capable of insights that had eluded professional researchers for decades. Alex, I want you to know that what you're suggesting about Dr. Hartwell's work, if true, would represent one of the most significant scientific discoveries in human history. The implications would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, physics, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Alex nodded solemnly. I know. That's why I think he disappeared. And that's why I need help figuring out what happened to him and whether his research still exists somewhere. Margaret felt the weight of decision settling around her shoulders. Professional protocol demanded that she report Alex's unauthorized access to restricted materials and ensure the child's return to appropriate supervision. But scientific curiosity and genuine concern for Alex's welfare suggested a different approach. What kind of help do you need? Alex's face brightened, with the first genuine smile Margaret had seen since their conversation began. I need someone with academic credentials who can access records that aren't available to the public. Official university documents, faculty meeting minutes, correspondence files. And I need someone who understands advanced physics well enough to help me work through the parts of Dr. Hartwell's research that I haven't been able to figure out on my own. Margaret realized that Alex was proposing an informal collaboration, a partnership between established academic authority and fresh perspective, unencumbered by decades of conventional thinking. The arrangement would be highly irregular, potentially problematic from an institutional standpoint, but intellectually fascinating. Alex, I need to ask you something important. If Dr. Hartwell's research led to the kind of discovery you're suggesting, and if that discovery was significant enough to cause his disappearance, are you prepared for the possibility that investigating his work might be dangerous? Alex's expression grew thoughtful, losing the excitement that had animated their discussion of mathematical concepts and theoretical breakthroughs. I've thought about that, but I don't think the danger comes from the knowledge itself. I think it comes from people who might want to use the knowledge in ways Dr. Hartwell wouldn't have approved of. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Throughout history, scientific discoveries had been weaponized by institutions and individuals seeking power rather than understanding. If Hartwell had indeed discovered fundamental principles governing consciousness and reality, such knowledge could be extraordinarily valuable to organizations interested in manipulation and control. That's a very mature way of thinking about the ethical implications of scientific research, Margaret said carefully, but it also means that investigating Dr. Hartwell's work might attract attention from people who wouldn't have your best interests at heart. Alex stood again, moving to a small window that provided the basement's only natural light. Afternoon sun filtered through decades of grime, casting patterns across the floor that resembled the mathematical diagrams scattered throughout Hartwell's journals. Dr. Chen, do you believe that some discoveries are too important to ignore, even if pursuing them might be risky? Margaret recognized the question as both philosophical inquiry and personal test. Alex was asking whether she possessed the intellectual courage necessary for the kind of investigation they were contemplating, research that might lead into territory where academic careers and personal safety could be at stake. I believe that truth has value independent of convenience or safety, Margaret replied, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. And I believe that brilliant minds like Dr. Hartwell's don't simply vanish without leaving traces that other brilliant minds can follow. Alex turned from the window, eyes bright with determination and something that might have been relief. Then will you help me find out what really happened to him? Margaret looked around the basement archive, taking in the rows of forgotten research files and abandoned academic projects. Somewhere in this vast collection of scholarly debris lay the scattered pieces of a mystery that had confounded experts for 8 decades. And standing before her was a 12-year-old child who claimed to have found the key to understanding what those experts had missed. Every rational part of Margaret's mind insisted that she should gently redirect Alex toward age-appropriate activities and properly supervised academic environments. But another part, the part that had driven her toward a career in theoretical research, recognized an opportunity that might never come again. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll help you." Alex's smile was radiant, transforming the child's serious face into something that reminded Margaret why she had originally been drawn to teaching. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. I promise you won't regret this." Margaret hoped Alex was right. But as she watched the child carefully return Hartwell's journal to its place among the archived materials, she couldn't shake the feeling that their collaboration would lead them both into territory that neither of them fully understood. The basement archive suddenly felt smaller, as if the weight of 80 years of unanswered questions was pressing down from the floors above. And somewhere in the shadows between the stacks of forgotten research, Margaret could almost sense the presence of Edmund Hartwell himself, waiting to see whether his final secret would finally be revealed. Alex moved through the archive with practiced familiarity, returning materials to their proper locations with the careful precision of someone who understood the importance of leaving no trace. Margaret watched, noting the methodical approach that suggested months of unauthorized visits had taught the child exactly how to navigate restricted spaces without detection. "How long have you been coming here?" Margaret asked as Alex sealed the last archival box. "Since the beginning of summer, 3 months, maybe a little more. I started in the public sections of the library, reading everything I could find about Dr. Hartwell's official research. But the published papers only covered his early work, the theories that led to his academic reputation. Nothing about his final projects or the circumstances of his disappearance." Margaret nodded, remembering her own frustration with the gaps in Hartwell's documented research. Academic publication moved slowly in the 1940s, and Hartwell's final theoretical breakthrough had occurred too close to his disappearance to result in peer-reviewed papers or formal presentations. "What made you think the archives might contain unpublished materials?" Alex paused, in the act of straightening a displaced file folder, expression growing distant. "My grandmother mentioned that universities sometimes kept private papers from prominent faculty members, especially if their work was considered sensitive or incomplete. She said that researchers sometimes deposited personal notes and experimental data in institutional archives, with restrictions on access until specific conditions were met." Margaret felt a spark of interest. Academic archives did indeed contain materials that weren't part of the public record, documents whose access was limited by time restrictions, family permissions, or institutional sensitivities. If Hartwell had left such materials, they might contain information about his final research that had never been made available to previous investigators. "Did your grandmother know Dr. Hartwell personally?" Alex hesitated, and Margaret caught a flicker of something complex crossing the child's face. She knew of him. She was a graduate student at MIT during the 1940s, working on related theoretical problems. She said the physics community was small enough that everyone knew about everyone else's research, especially work as revolutionary as Dr. Hartwell's appeared to be. Margaret sensed there was more to the story than Alex was sharing, but she didn't press. Many academic families carried histories of connection and collaboration that stretched across generations, informal networks of intellectual influence that shaped research directions and career paths. What did she tell you about the physics community's reaction to Dr. Hartwell's disappearance? Alex moved toward the basement exit, checking to ensure their conversation hadn't attracted unwanted attention. She said it was handled very quietly. No official investigation, no public speculation about what might have happened. Just a gradual consensus that Dr. Hartwell had suffered some kind of breakdown and chosen to leave academic life rather than continue with research that had become too stressful to sustain. Margaret frowned. The explanation Alex described matched the official historical record, but it had always struck her as inadequate. Brilliant academics occasionally did leave, their careers due to personal crises, but complete disappearances were virtually unknown. Someone of Hartwell's stature would have left traces, connections to former colleagues, or continuing involvement in scientific communities. Did your grandmother believe that explanation? Alex's expression grew guarded again. She said it was the kind of story that gets told when the truth would be too complicated for public consumption. She said that sometimes very smart people discover things that society isn't ready to understand, and that institutions have ways of making sure those discoveries don't disrupt established systems. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Academic institutions, like all large organizations, possessed subtle mechanisms for controlling information flow and managing potentially disruptive discoveries. Tenure systems, publication processes, and funding structures all serve to channel research in acceptable directions, while discouraging investigation of topics deemed inappropriate or dangerous. Alex, what you're suggesting implies a level of institutional conspiracy that would be difficult to maintain over 8 decades. Academic communities aren't generally capable of keeping secrets that long. Alex paused at the basement door. 1. And on the exit handle. Unless the secret is protected by people who aren't part of the academic community. People who have different reasons for wanting certain kinds of knowledge to remain hidden. Margaret's pulse quickened. Alex's suggestion implied involvement by organizations with resources and motivations beyond those of typical university administration. Government agencies, military contractors, or private research institutions that operated outside normal academic oversight. What makes you think non-academic organizations might be involved? Alex opened the door carefully, checking the corridor beyond for signs of security personnel or other potential witnesses. Because Dr. Hartwell's research was funded by sources that aren't listed in any university records. Private foundations, with names that don't correspond to any registered organizations, and because some of his final experiments required equipment that Harvard didn't own and couldn't afford. Margaret followed Alex into the corridor, mind racing through the implications of what the child had discovered. Research funding in the 1940s had indeed come from diverse sources, including government programs and private organizations whose activities weren't subject to public oversight. If Hartwell had been supported by such entities, his disappearance might have been orchestrated by people with access to resources far beyond those available to university administrators. How did you find information about Dr. Hartwell's funding sources? Alex led them through a maze of basement corridors that seemed to bypass the library's main security checkpoints. Financial records from the 1940s aren't digitized, but they're still stored in physical form in the university's administrative archives. Different building, different security system, same basic approach to gaining access. Margaret realized that Alex's unauthorized research had extended far beyond the basement where they had met. The child had systematically investigated multiple archive locations, piecing together information from sources that professional historians might not have thought to examine. Alex, what you're describing represents a significant breach of university security protocols. If you've been accessing restricted financial records, there could be serious legal consequences. Alex paused at what appeared to be a service elevator, pressing the call button with practiced familiarity. I know, but I also know that if Dr. Hartwell's research was as significant as I think it was, and if powerful people were involved in making him disappear, then normal legal and academic channels aren't going to provide answers. Sometimes you have to break small rules to uncover bigger truths. Margaret found herself both impressed and concerned by Alex's reasoning. The child demonstrated sophisticated understanding of institutional power dynamics and research methodology, but also showed a willingness to take risks that could result in serious consequences for both of them. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Alex gestured for Margaret to enter first. As the doors closed behind them, Margaret realized that she was now fully committed to whatever investigation Alex had initiated. There would be no returning to her previous understanding of Hartwell's disappearance or her own role as a conventional academic researcher. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as Alex pressed a button for the third floor. "To your office. We need to start organizing what I've already discovered and figure out what additional information we'll need to access. And Dr. Chen?" Alex looked up with an expression that was both grateful and determined. "Thank you for taking this seriously. I know it probably seems crazy, but I think we're going to find something that changes everything." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure whether Alex's confidence was inspiring or terrifying. As the elevator climbed toward floors where her professional reputation and academic career could be either made or destroyed, she reflected on the curious path that had led her to collaborate with a 12-year-old investigator on a mystery that had confounded experts for 8 decades. The elevator doors opened onto a corridor lined with faculty offices, the familiar territory where Margaret had spent countless hours in research and teaching. But now, walking beside Alex toward her own office, everything felt different. The hallway seemed charged with possibility and danger, as if the very air contained secrets waiting to be discovered. Margaret unlocked her office door and gestured for Alex to enter, watching as the child took in the space with the same careful attention that had characterized their entire interaction. Books lined every wall, papers covered every surface, and a whiteboard displayed mathematical equations from Margaret's current research project. Alex moved directly to the whiteboard, studying Margaret's work with obvious interest. "You're working on consciousness field theory." Margaret blinked, surprised by Alex's immediate recognition of research that was highly specialized even within theoretical physics. "How did you know that?" Alex pointed to a series of equations near the center of the board. These relationships between information processing and energy distribution, they're similar to some of Dr. Hartwell's final calculations, but approached from a different mathematical framework. Margaret felt excitement building as she realized that her current research might indeed be related to Hartwell's final breakthrough. She had been investigating theoretical models that treated consciousness as a fundamental field rather than an emergent property of complex neural networks, work that existed at the cutting edge of both physics and neuroscience. "Alex, are you suggesting that Dr. Hartwell was working on consciousness field theory in 1943? That would mean he was decades ahead of current research." Alex nodded eagerly. "I think he didn't just theorize about consciousness fields. I think he found a way to detect them experimentally, and I think that's what got him into trouble." Margaret sank into her desk chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what Alex was proposing. Experimental verification of consciousness as a fundamental field would represent a scientific revolution comparable to the discovery of quantum mechanics or relativity theory. Such a breakthrough would indeed attract attention from organizations interested in applications that Hartwell might have found ethically unacceptable. Alex, if what you're suggesting is true, then Dr. Hartwell's research represents one of the most significant scientific discoveries in human history. The implications for our understanding of mind, reality, and human potential would be extraordinary. Alex pulled a chair closer to Margaret's desk, settling in with the focused attention of someone preparing for a long and complex discussion. That's why I need your help, Dr. Chen. What I've discovered so far is just the beginning. But to really understand what Dr. Hartwell found and what happened to him, we're going to need resources and expertise that I can't provide on my own. Margaret looked at the earnest young face across from her desk, seeing intelligence, determination, and something else that might have been loneliness. Alex had been pursuing this investigation alone for months, carrying the weight of potentially world-changing discoveries without adult support or guidance. "What do you need from me?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would involve commitments that would fundamentally alter her academic career and personal life. Alex smiled, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the excitement that had been driving the child's unauthorized research for months. "I need someone who can help me access the rest of Dr. Hartwell's materials. I need someone who understands advanced physics well enough to help me decode his final equations. And I need someone who can help me figure out what happened to him and whether his research still exists somewhere." Margaret realized that Alex was proposing a full partnership, a collaboration that would combine the child's insights and discoveries with her own academic credentials and research experience. The arrangement would be unprecedented, potentially revolutionary, and almost certainly dangerous. But as she looked at the mathematical equations on her whiteboard and thought about the decades she had spent pursuing theoretical breakthroughs that might finally be within reach, Margaret knew that she could not refuse. "All right, Alex, let's find out what really happened to Dr. Edmund Hartwell." Dr. Margaret Chen's office had transformed into something resembling a war room. Within 48 hours of her agreement to help Alex Rivera investigate Edmund Hartwell's disappearance, papers covered every available surface, creating overlapping layers of photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and printed computer files. Alex had produced an astonishing array of materials gathered during months of covert research, while Margaret had used her academic credentials to access official university records that painted a far more complex picture of Hartwell's final months than any published biography suggested. The morning light streaming through Margaret's office windows illuminated charts and timelines that Alex had constructed with meticulous attention to detail. The child possessed an organizational mind that rivaled any graduate student Margaret had supervised, combined with an intuitive understanding of research methodology that seemed to transcend formal training. Watching Alex work, Margaret found herself repeatedly amazed by the sophistication of the investigation that had been conducted entirely without adult supervision or institutional support. Alex sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by financial documents that revealed the true complexity of Hartwell's research funding during his final year at Harvard. The child's discovery of these records represented a breakthrough that professional historians had somehow missed, possibly because they had focused on academic sources while neglecting the administrative archives, where actual financial transactions were documented. "Dr. Chen, look at this pattern," Alex said, holding up a series of payment vouchers dated between January and October 1943. Dr. Hartwell received funding from 3 different organizations during his last months, but none of them appear in any university research databases. The Meridian Foundation, Apex Scientific Consulting, and something called the Consciousness Research Initiative. Margaret leaned closer to examine the documents, noting the official letterheads and authorization, signatures that confirmed their authenticity. Each organization had provided substantial funding for what were described as theoretical investigations into observer consciousness effects and experimental verification of field-based awareness phenomena. The amounts involved were significant, enough to support extensive research operations, far beyond what typical academic grants could provide. Have you been able to find any other references to these organizations? Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal another layer of mystery rather than provide simple explanations. Alex shook her head, frustration evident in the gesture. I've searched through every database I can access, including government contract records and scientific foundation directories. It's like these organizations existed just long enough to fund Dr. Hartwell's research, then disappeared completely. Margaret felt a familiar chill as she contemplated the implications. Organizations that appeared and vanished without leaving permanent records suggested levels of institutional coordination that exceeded normal academic or even government bureaucracy. Such careful erasure of evidence required resources and motivation that pointed toward involvement by entities whose activities were deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. Alex, what you're describing sounds like front organizations designed to provide funding while maintaining complete anonymity for the actual sponsors. That level of operational security typically indicates either government intelligence agencies or private organizations with significant resources and strong motivations for secrecy. Alex's expression grew more serious as she absorbed Margaret's analysis. That's what I was afraid you'd say. Because if powerful people were funding Dr. Hartwell's research, and if his discoveries were significant enough to warrant that level of secrecy, then his disappearance probably wasn't voluntary. Margaret nodded grimly. The financial evidence suggested that Hartwell had become involved with organizations whose interests extended far beyond pure scientific research. In the context of 1943, such involvement could have connected him to wartime research programs, intelligence operations, or private initiatives whose objectives might have conflicted with his personal ethical standards. What else have you discovered about Dr. Hartwell's activities during his final months? Alex moved to another pile of documents, these bearing the official seals of Harvard's administrative offices. This is where it gets really interesting. According to university records, Dr. Hartwell requested access to facilities and equipment that Harvard didn't normally provide for theoretical physics research. Electromagnetic field generators, precision measurement devices, even what appears to be early computer equipment for data analysis. Margaret examined the equipment requisition forms, noting specifications that seemed unusually advanced for 1940s technology. The devices Hartwell had requested would have been expensive and difficult to obtain, requiring connections to military contractors or industrial research facilities that typically didn't collaborate with academic institutions. These requisitions were all approved, Margaret observed, studying the authorization signatures. Someone with significant influence within the university was supporting Dr. Hartwell's unusual research requirements. Alex nodded enthusiastically. That's what led me to investigate the university's administrative hierarchy during 1943. And that's where I found something that explains how Dr. Hartwell gained access to resources that should have been far beyond Harvard's normal capabilities. Alex produced another set of documents, these bearing the personal letterhead of Dr. Lawrence Whitman, who had served as Harvard's president during the early 1940s. The correspondence revealed ongoing communication between Whitman and representatives of the mysterious funding organizations, discussions that clearly indicated the university administration's knowledge of and cooperation with Hartwell's unusual research program. Dr. Whitman wasn't just aware of Dr. Hartwell's external funding, Alex explained, pointing to specific passages in the correspondence. He was actively facilitating it. Look at this letter from March 1943, where Whitman assures the Meridian Foundation that Harvard will provide complete discretion regarding Dr. Hartwell's activities, and that all research documentation will be handled according to special protocols established by the funding organizations. Margaret felt her understanding of Hartwell's situation shifting dramatically. Rather than an isolated researcher pursuing personal theoretical interests, Hartwell appeared to have been operating at the center of a carefully coordinated program involving university administration, mysterious funding sources, and research objectives that required extraordinary secrecy. Alex, what you've uncovered suggests that Dr. Hartwell's research was part of a larger operation involving multiple institutions and organizations. His disappearance might not have been an individual decision, but rather the result of circumstances beyond his personal control. Alex's expression combined excitement with apprehension as she absorbed the implications of her discoveries. That's what I think too. But it also means that investigating what happened to him might be more dangerous than we originally realized. If powerful organizations were involved in his disappearance, they might not want anyone asking questions. About it 80 years later, Margaret considered the risks they might be taking by pursuing their investigation. Academic research typically involved minimal personal danger, but delving into matters involving government agencies, intelligence operations, or powerful private interests could attract unwanted attention from people with resources and motivations, far beyond normal institutional oversight. Alex, before we continue, I need to ask whether you've told anyone else about your discoveries. Your grandmother, friends, anyone who might know about your research into Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. Alex shook her head quickly. Nobody knows except you. I haven't even told my grandmother about the specific details, just that I'm interested in physics history, and I don't really have friends who would understand this kind of research. Margaret noted the slight sadness that crossed Alex's face with the admission about friends, a reminder that the child's intellectual capabilities likely created social isolation that made adult collaboration particularly valuable. But Alex's discretion also meant that their investigation remained completely private, reducing the likelihood of unwanted attention from people who might prefer that Hartwell's secrets remain buried. That's probably wise, but it also means that we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If the organizations that funded Dr. Hartwell's research still exist in some form, they might have ongoing interests in preventing his discoveries from becoming public knowledge. Alex stood and moved to Margaret's whiteboard, where she had begun constructing a timeline of Hartwell's final months using information from the various documents they had gathered. The timeline revealed a pattern of accelerating activity during the weeks before his disappearance, with increasing frequency of meetings, equipment deliveries, and communications with external organizations. Dr. Chen. I think Dr. Hartwell realized that his research was leading toward discoveries that could be misused by the people funding it. Look at this sequence of events during his final weeks. Alex pointed to a series of entries near the end of the timeline, showing Hartwell's attempts to contact colleagues at other universities. His requests for independent verification of experimental results, and what appeared to be efforts to document his findings in ways that would preserve them beyond the control of his funding organizations. He was trying to protect his discoveries, Margaret realized, studying the pattern Alex had identified, creating backup documentation, reaching out to trusted colleagues, establishing independent verification of his results. Classic behavior for a researcher who suspects that external forces might try to suppress or weaponize his work. Alex nodded grimly. And then, everything stops. No more communications, no more experimental work, no more attempts to contact outside colleagues. Just complete silence, followed by his official disappearance 3 weeks later. Margaret felt a chill as she contemplated what the timeline suggested about Hartwell's final weeks. The abrupt termination of all research activity indicated either a voluntary decision to cease work or external intervention that prevented him from continuing. Given the evidence of powerful organizational involvement, external intervention seemed far more likely than voluntary withdrawal. Alex, if Dr. Hartwell was forced to stop his research, what do you think happened to his experimental data and theoretical documentation? Organizations sophisticated enough to orchestrate his disappearance would certainly have secured any materials that could compromise their interests. Alex's expression brightened with the excitement of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. That's what I've been hoping to discuss with you, because I don't think they got everything. I think Dr. Hartwell anticipated what might happen and took steps to preserve his most important discoveries in ways that his sponsors wouldn't expect. Alex moved to a corner of Margaret's office where she had stacked several boxes of materials that Margaret hadn't yet examined. Remember how I mentioned that Dr. Hartwell was trying to contact colleagues at other universities during his final weeks? I've been tracking down those communications, and I found something that changes everything we know about what happened to his research. Alex opened the topmost box, revealing a collection of letters, telegrams, and academic papers that appeared to span several decades. These materials came from the estate of Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist at MIT who worked on related theoretical problems during the 1940s. She died in 1987, and her papers were donated to MIT's archives with a 50-year restriction on access. The restriction expired 2 years ago, and I was able to access the collection during one of my research trips. Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized the potential significance of what Alex had discovered. Contemporary correspondence between Hartwell and other researchers could provide insights into his final work that weren't available through Harvard's archives, particularly if Hartwell had shared sensitive information with trusted colleagues outside his immediate institutional environment. What did Dr. Chen's papers reveal about her communications with Dr. Hartwell? Alex carefully extracted a folder containing photocopies of letters written in Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. Dr. Hartwell wasn't just describing his theoretical breakthroughs to Dr. Chen. He was sending her copies of his experimental data and asking her to conduct independent verification of his results using equipment at MIT. Margaret examined the letters, noting dates that corresponded to the final weeks of Hartwell's timeline. The correspondence revealed a level of scientific detail that confirmed Alex's assertions about the revolutionary nature of Hartwell's discoveries. But more importantly, it suggested that verified documentation of his work might exist outside Harvard's archives. Alex, are you saying that Dr. Chen successfully replicated Dr. Hartwell's experiments? That independent verification of his results exists in MIT's archives? Alex's smile was radiant as she confirmed Margaret's understanding. Not only did Dr. Chen replicate his experiments, she continued developing his theoretical framework. For years after his disappearance, her papers contained decades of additional research building on Dr. Hartwell's foundations, work that was never published because she feared the same organizations that caused his disappearance might target her. As well, Margaret felt excitement building as she contemplated the implications of Alex's discovery. If Chen had successfully continued Hartwell's research, her archives might contain not only verification of his original discoveries, but also decades of additional development that could provide a complete picture of the theoretical breakthroughs that had cost Hartwell his career and possibly his life. What kind of results did Dr. Chen achieve? Was she able to confirm Dr. Hartwell's claims about consciousness as a fundamental field? Alex opened another folder, revealing pages of experimental data and theoretical calculations that extended far beyond anything Margaret had seen in Hartwell's original notes. Dr. Chen didn't just confirm his results. She developed practical applications that proved consciousness could be detected, measured, and even influenced through electromagnetic field manipulation. Her work represents a complete science of consciousness that could revolutionize our understanding of human potential and the nature of reality itself. Margaret stared at the documents, overwhelmed by the implications of what Alex had uncovered. A complete science of consciousness, developed in secret over decades by a researcher who feared persecution for her discoveries, represented knowledge that could indeed transform human civilization if properly understood and ethically applied. Alex, if Dr. Chen's research provides practical applications for consciousness field theory, why did she never publish her work? Why keep such important discoveries secret for her entire career? Alex's expression grew somber as she contemplated the question. Because she witnessed what happened to Dr. Hartwell when he tried to share similar discoveries. Dr. Chen's papers include detailed accounts of the intimidation and pressure that researchers in this field experienced during the 1940s and 1950s. She realized that premature disclosure of consciousness field technology could lead to applications that would be harmful rather than beneficial to humanity. Margaret nodded, understanding the ethical dilemma that had trapped both Hartwell and Chen. Revolutionary scientific discoveries often carried the potential for both beneficial and harmful applications, requiring careful consideration of how and when to share knowledge with broader communities. In the case of consciousness research, the implications for human autonomy and social control would indeed raise profound ethical concerns. What did Dr. Chen recommend regarding the eventual disclosure of consciousness field research? Alex extracted a final document from the folder, a letter dated just months before Chen's death in 1987. She believed that consciousness field technology should only be shared when humanity had developed sufficient ethical sophistication to prevent its misuse. She established criteria for determining when disclosure would be appropriate, including the existence of international agreements governing consciousness research and the development of educational programs that would prepare society for the implications of consciousness field technology. Margaret read Chen's letter carefully, noting the thoughtful analysis of conditions that would need to exist before consciousness research could be safely integrated into broader scientific and social communities. Chen's recommendations revealed a level of wisdom and foresight that impressed Margaret as much as the technical brilliance evident in her experimental work. Alex, do you believe that Dr. Chen's criteria for disclosure have been met? Are we ready as a society to handle the implications of consciousness field technology? Alex considered the question carefully before responding. I think we're closer than we were in Dr. Chen's time, but probably not completely ready. The internet has created possibilities for sharing knowledge that didn't exist when she was writing, but it's also created new risks for how that knowledge might be misused. Margaret appreciated Alex's thoughtful analysis of the challenges involved in responsibly sharing revolutionary discoveries. The child's understanding of both scientific and social implications suggested a level of maturity that exceeded her chronological age, possibly developed through months of grappling with the ethical complexities surrounding Hartwell's and Chen's research. What do you think we should do with the information we've discovered? Do we have an obligation to continue Dr. Chen's work and eventually share her discoveries with the broader scientific community? Alex stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Harvard campus, where students and faculty pursued normal academic activities, unaware of the revolutionary knowledge hidden in archives and restricted collections. I think we have an obligation to understand the full scope of what Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Chen discovered. But I also think we need to be very careful about how we proceed, because the same organizations that made Dr. Hartwell disappear might still be interested in controlling consciousness research. Margaret joined Alex at the window, contemplating the weight of responsibility that their investigation had revealed. They possessed knowledge that could potentially transform human understanding of consciousness and reality, but they also faced ethical and practical challenges that had confounded brilliant researchers for decades. Alex, continuing this research will require resources and expertise that go far beyond what either of us can provide independently. We'll need access to specialized equipment, collaboration with other researchers, and possibly legal protection. If we encounter opposition from organizations that prefer to keep consciousness research secret. Alex turned from the window with an expression that combined determination with apprehension. I know. That's why I think we need to start building a network of people who can help us, researchers and institutions that share our commitment to ethical science and responsible disclosure. Margaret realized that Alex was proposing to expand their informal partnership into a larger, collaborative effort involving multiple researchers and institutions. Such an expansion would provide greater resources and protection, but would also increase the visibility of their work and the likelihood of attracting unwanted attention. Who did you have in mind as potential collaborators? Alex moved back to the documents scattered across Margaret's office, pulling out a list of names and institutions that she had apparently compiled during her months of research. Dr. Chen's papers include references to other researchers who were working on related problems during the 1940s and 1950s. Some of them are still alive, and others have students and colleagues who might be interested in continuing their work. Margaret examined Alex's list, noting names that she recognized from her own research into consciousness field theory. The potential collaborators included some of the most respected researchers in theoretical physics and neuroscience, people whose involvement would provide both scientific credibility and institutional protection for their investigation. Alex, approaching these researchers will require careful planning and considerable discretion. We'll need to present our discoveries in ways that demonstrate their significance without immediately revealing the full scope of what we've uncovered. Alex nodded eagerly. I've been thinking about that. We could start by sharing some of Dr. Chen's theoretical work without mentioning the historical connections to Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. Once we establish scientific credibility for the consciousness field concepts, we could gradually reveal the additional evidence that supports our conclusions. Margaret was impressed by Alex's strategic thinking about how to build support for their research while minimizing risks. The child's approach demonstrated understanding of academic politics and institutional dynamics that typically required years of professional experience to develop. That's a sound strategy, but it will require us to be prepared for skepticism and possible hostility from researchers who are committed to conventional approaches to consciousness research. Consciousness field theory challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind and reality that many scientists have built their careers defending. Alex's expression grew more serious as she contemplated the challenges they would face from scientific orthodoxy. Dr. Chen's papers include accounts of the resistance she encountered when she tried to share her early findings with colleagues. But she also describes researchers who were open to new ideas and willing to examine evidence that contradicted their previous assumptions. Margaret nodded, remembering her own experiences with scientific conservatism and the difficulties involved in introducing revolutionary concepts to established research communities. Success would require not only compelling evidence, but also careful attention to presentation and timing that would maximize receptivity while minimizing defensive reactions. Alex, before we begin reaching out to potential collaborators, I think we need to organize our evidence more systematically and prepare materials that will allow us to present our discoveries in the most compelling possible way. We'll need to anticipate questions and objections while demonstrating the scientific rigor of our investigation. Alex's face brightened with enthusiasm as she contemplated the next phase of their research. I've already started working on that. I have preliminary drafts of papers that summarize Dr. Hartwell's original discoveries and Dr. Chen's subsequent research, along with analysis of the historical evidence surrounding Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. And Alex opened another box, revealing carefully organized files containing what appeared to be professional quality research papers, complete with citations, references, and technical appendices. Margaret was amazed by the scope and sophistication of the work Alex had produced without any formal guidance or institutional support. Alex, this represents an extraordinary amount of work for someone your age. The level of organization and attention to detail rivals anything I've seen from graduate students or professional researchers. Alex seemed pleased by Margaret's recognition, but remained focused on the practical challenges ahead. Thank you, Dr. Chen, but I know that having good research materials is only the first step. We still need to figure out how to share our discoveries without putting ourselves or other researchers at risk. Margaret realized that Alex's concern about risk was well-founded. If the organizations that had orchestrated Hartwell's disappearance still existed and still had interests in controlling consciousness research, their investigation could indeed attract dangerous attention. Proceeding would require not only scientific courage, but also practical wisdom about how to protect themselves and their potential collaborators. Alex, I think we need to establish some basic security protocols before we begin contacting other researchers. We should consider using secure communication methods, meeting in neutral locations, and developing contingency plans in case our investigation encounters opposition. Alex nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Chen's papers include recommendations about research security that she developed after Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. She believed that consciousness research is needed to operate more like intelligence agents than traditional academics, with careful attention to operational security and collaborative protocols that would protect everyone involved. Margaret was both impressed and sobered by the realization that ethical consciousness research required levels of caution typically associated with dangerous or illegal activities. The fact that brilliant scientists had felt compelled to operate in secrecy for decades suggested the existence of powerful forces that viewed consciousness research as a threat to their interests. What kind of security measures did Dr. Chen recommend? Alex extracted another file from her carefully organized collection, revealing detailed protocols for secure communication, document storage, and collaborative research that could protect researchers from surveillance and interference. Dr. Chen believed that consciousness researchers needed to create a parallel scientific community that could pursue important work without attracting attention from organizations that might want to suppress or weaponize their discoveries. Margaret read through Chen's security recommendations, noting suggestions that seemed both paranoid and prudent, depending on one's assessment of the actual threats facing consciousness researchers. The protocols included methods for encrypted communication, anonymous collaboration, and distributed data storage that would prevent any single organization from gaining control over important research materials. Alex, Implementing these security measures will significantly complicate our research process. Are you prepared for the additional complexity and the limitations on normal academic communication and collaboration? Alex's expression was resolute as she considered Margaret's question. Dr. Chen worked under these constraints for over 40 years and still managed to make extraordinary discoveries. If security protocols are necessary to protect our research and the people involved in it, then I think we have to accept that complexity as the price of doing important work. Margaret was struck by Alex's maturity and commitment to pursuing consciousness research despite the challenges and risks involved. The child's dedication to understanding Hartwell's and Chen's discoveries exceeded what Margaret typically saw from professional researchers facing far less demanding circumstances. All right, Alex, let's begin implementing Dr. Chen's security protocols and start reaching out to potential collaborators. But we'll need to be extremely careful about how we proceed, and we'll need to be prepared to stop if we encounter evidence that our investigation is attracting unwanted attention. Alex smiled with genuine excitement for the first time since they had begun discussing the risks and challenges associated with their research. Thank you, Dr. Chen. I know this is a lot more complicated than normal academic research, but I really believe that understanding Dr. Hartwell's and Dr. Chen's work could change everything we know about human consciousness and our place in the universe. Margaret nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as she contemplated the path they were embarking on together. Their investigation had already revealed evidence of revolutionary discoveries that had been hidden for decades, and continuing their research might uncover knowledge that could indeed transform human understanding of consciousness and reality. But Margaret also understood that their work would take them into territory where academic freedom and scientific inquiry intersected with power structures and organizational interests that had proven willing to use extreme measures to protect their secrets. Success would require not only intellectual courage, but also practical wisdom about how to navigate dangers that most researchers never encountered. As afternoon light faded from Margaret's office windows, she and Alex continued, planning their next steps, surrounded by evidence of discoveries that could change the world and secrets that had been worth killing to protect. Outside, the Harvard campus continued its normal rhythms of teaching and learning, unaware that two researchers in a cluttered faculty office were preparing to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human consciousness and the forces that shaped scientific progress. Margaret looked at Alex, seeing in the child's determined expression the same intellectual passion that had driven Hartwell and Chen to pursue dangerous knowledge despite extraordinary risks. Tomorrow, they would begin reaching out to other researchers, starting the process of building a collaborative network that could finally bring consciousness field theory into the light of open scientific inquiry. But tonight, Margaret found herself wondering whether they truly understood the magnitude of what they were attempting, and whether their dedication to truth and scientific progress would prove stronger than the forces that had kept consciousness research hidden for 8 decades. The answer would determine not only their personal futures, but potentially the future of human understanding itself. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore had been expecting the encrypted email for 3 days, ever since her old colleague at MIT had mentioned receiving an unusual inquiry about consciousness field research from someone at Harvard. The message arrived at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, routed through multiple servers and bearing digital signatures that confirmed both its authenticity and the sender's commitment to operational security protocols that she hadn't seen used since her early career in government-sponsored research. The email was brief, professional, and carefully worded to convey maximum information while revealing minimum details about the sender's true objectives. Dr. Margaret Chen requested a private meeting to discuss theoretical work related to observer consciousness effects in quantum systems, with particular interest in historical research conducted during the 1940s. The message included academic credentials that Whitmore verified through multiple channels, along with preliminary research. Summaries that demonstrated genuine expertise in consciousness field theory. What captured Whitmore's attention wasn't the sophistication of the research materials or even the unusual security precautions. It was the mathematical notation used in the theoretical summaries, equations that bore unmistakable resemblance to work she had encountered decades earlier during her brief involvement with classified consciousness research programs. The similarity was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that Chen had gained access to materials that Whitmore had assumed were permanently buried in government archives. Whitmore's response was equally cautious, proposing a meeting at a small coffee shop in neutral territory between Harvard and her current research position at Boston University. She suggested a time when the venue would be crowded enough to provide anonymity but quiet enough to permit sensitive conversation. Her reply included her own verification codes and preliminary questions that would allow her to assess Chen's knowledge without revealing her own extensive background in consciousness research. Margaret received Whitmore's response with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Alex had identified Whitmore as a crucial potential ally based on papers published in the 1970s that dealt with quantum consciousness interfaces. But Margaret had worried that decades of academic caution might have made Whitmore unwilling to engage with research that challenged conventional scientific boundaries. The fact that Whitmore had responded using proper security protocols suggested both familiarity with sensitive research and willingness to pursue inquiries that required extraordinary discretion. Alex insisted on attending the meeting despite Margaret's concerns about involving a 12-year-old in discussions that might touch on dangerous historical events. The child's argument was compelling. Alex possessed more detailed knowledge of Hartwell's and Chen's research than Margaret could hope to acquire in weeks of additional study, and Alex's insights might prove crucial for establishing credibility. With a researcher as experienced as Whitmore, Margaret reluctantly agreed, but only after establishing strict protocols for the meeting that would protect Alex while allowing the child to contribute to the conversation. They would present Alex as a gifted young researcher working under Margaret's supervision, with Margaret taking responsibility for answering any questions about their investigation that might reveal sensitive details about their discoveries. The coffee shop was exactly as Whitmore had described, busy enough to mask conversation, but with corner tables that provided privacy for discussions requiring discretion. Margaret and Alex arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table that offered clear sightlines to both entrances while providing easy exit routes in case the meeting attracted unwanted attention. Whitmore entered precisely on time, moving, with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to environments where surveillance was a constant possibility. She was in her 70s, but carried herself with the alertness of someone much younger, grey hair pulled back in a practical style that emphasized intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the coffee shop's other patrons before focusing on Margaret and Alex. "Dr. Chen, I presume," Whitmore said as she approached their table, extending a hand in greeting while her eyes took in Alex with obvious curiosity. "And this must be your research associate. I'm Eleanor Whitmore." Margaret stood to shake hands, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested decades of experience with high-stakes academic and professional negotiations. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Dr. Whitmore. This is Alex Rivera, who has been instrumental in our research into historical consciousness studies." Whitmore settled into the chair across from them, accepting Margaret's offer of coffee while continuing to study Alex with the intense attention of someone trying to reconcile the child's apparent age with the sophisticated research materials that had been included in Margaret's initial contact. Alex, Dr. Chen's preliminary materials suggest that you've been investigating some very advanced theoretical concepts. That's unusual for someone your age. Alex met Whitmore's gaze with the calm confidence that Margaret had learned to associate with the child's approach to adult interactions. I've been studying the work of researchers who were exploring consciousness field theory before it became an accepted area of investigation. Some of their discoveries were more advanced than current academic literature suggests. Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly at Alex's response, and Margaret caught a flicker of recognition in the older woman's expression that suggested Alex's comment had triggered specific memories related to historical consciousness research. Which researchers have you been studying? Consciousness field theory has a complex history that includes both legitimate scientific work and more speculative investigations. Alex exchanged a quick glance with Margaret before responding, a signal they had arranged to indicate that the conversation was moving into territory that required careful navigation. We've been particularly interested in the work of Dr. Edmund Hartwell and Dr. Margaret Chen, researchers who were investigating observer consciousness effects in quantum systems during the 1940s and subsequent decades. The effect of Alex's words on Whitmore was immediate and unmistakable. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and her expression shifted from polite academic interest to something approaching alarm. She set the cup down carefully and leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Where did you encounter those names? Dr. Hartwell's work was classified decades ago, and Dr. Chen's research was never published in any academic forum that would be accessible to normal university research. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Whitmore's response confirmed their suspicions about the sensitive nature of Hartwell's and Chen's discoveries. The older woman's obvious familiarity with both researchers suggested either direct involvement with their work or access to information that had been kept secret from mainstream academic communities. Dr. Whitmore, we've been investigating Dr. Hartwell's disappearance in 1943 and the circumstances surrounding his final research projects. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that his work was far more advanced than published accounts suggest, and that his disappearance may not have been voluntary. Whitmore glanced around the coffee shop, checking to ensure that nearby tables were occupied by people engaged in their own conversations rather than listening to their discussion. Dr. Chen, what you're describing represents research into matters that some people prefer to keep buried. Before we continue this conversation, I need to understand exactly what materials you've accessed and who else might be aware of your investigation. Alex leaned forward, matching Whitmore's serious tone. We've found financial records showing that Dr. Hartwell was funded by organizations that disappeared after his vanishing. We've also accessed Dr. Chen's archived research materials at MIT, including decades of work that continued Dr. Hartwell's theoretical breakthroughs. Whitmore's expression grew increasingly grave as Alex described the scope of their discoveries. Dr. Chen's archives were supposed to remain restricted for another 20 years. How did you gain access to materials that should have been sealed until 2047? Alex's expression became slightly sheepish, reminding Margaret of the child's actual age despite the sophisticated nature of their conversation. The restriction was based on administrative oversight rather than legal requirements. When the 50-year seal expired, the materials became available to researchers who knew where to look and could demonstrate legitimate academic interest. Whitmore shook her head slowly, seeming to absorb the implications of what Alex had accomplished. Through persistent and clever research, Alex, what you've done represents either extraordinary luck or exceptional investigative skill. Dr. Chen's research materials contain information that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and reality, but they also contain evidence of activities that powerful people have spent decades trying to keep secret. Margaret seized the opportunity to probe Whitmore's apparent familiarity with the sensitive aspects of consciousness research. Dr. Whitmore, your responses suggest that you have direct knowledge of the historical events we're investigating. Can you help us understand what really happened to Dr. Hartwell and why consciousness research has been suppressed for so many decades? Whitmore was silent for a long moment, apparently weighing the risks of sharing information that she had kept confidential for most of her career. Dr. Chen, Alex, what I'm about to tell you must never be repeated without my explicit permission, and it must never be documented in any form that could be traced back to this conversation. Do I have your agreement? Margaret and Alex both nodded solemnly, understanding that Whitmore was preparing to share information that could put all of them at risk if it fell into the wrong hands. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she realized they were about to learn details about consciousness research that had been hidden from public knowledge for decades. I was involved with government-sponsored consciousness research during the 1970s and 1980s, Whitmore began, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's background noise. The programs were officially discontinued, but they had been building on theoretical foundations established by researchers like Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Chen decades earlier. Alex's eyes widened with the realization that Whitmore possessed first-hand knowledge of the continuation of Hartwell's research through official government channels. What kind of research were you doing? Were you able to replicate Dr. Hartwell's results? Whitmore glanced around the coffee shop again before responding, clearly uncomfortable with discussing classified activities in a public setting. We not only replicated his results, we extended them far beyond anything Dr. Hartwell had achieved during his brief time at Harvard. By the 1980s, we had developed practical applications for consciousness field manipulation that could influence human perception, memory, and decision-making processes. Margaret felt a chill as she absorbed the implications of Whitmore's revelation. Practical applications for consciousness manipulation represented technology that could be used for everything from therapeutic intervention to coercive control, depending on the ethical orientation of the people wielding such capabilities. Dr. Whitmore, if consciousness field technology was successfully developed decades ago, why hasn't it been made available for beneficial applications like treating mental illness or enhancing human cognitive capabilities? Whitmore's expression grew bitter as she contemplated Margaret's question. Because the organizations that funded consciousness research were primarily interested in applications that served their institutional objectives rather than human welfare. Therapeutic applications were considered secondary to surveillance, interrogation, and behavioral modification capabilities that could be used for intelligence gathering and social control. Alex leaned back in her chair, apparently overwhelmed by the realization that consciousness research had been weaponized rather than developed for humanitarian purposes. Is that why Dr. Hartwell disappeared? Did he realize that his discoveries were being used for harmful applications? Whitmore nodded slowly. Dr. Hartwell attempted to withdraw from the research programs when he understood how his theoretical breakthroughs were being applied. He tried to destroy his experimental data and documentation, but his funding organizations had already copied everything he had developed. His disappearance was arranged to prevent him from alerting other researchers about the unethical applications of consciousness field technology. Margaret felt anger building as she processed Whitmore's explanation of Hartwell's fate. A brilliant scientist had been eliminated not because his research was flawed or dangerous, but because he possessed ethical principles that conflicted with institutional objectives that prioritized power over human welfare. Dr. Whitmore, what happened to Dr. Chen? Did she face similar pressure from organizations that wanted to control consciousness research? Whitmore's expression softened slightly as she spoke about Chen's more successful approach to protecting her research. Dr. Chen was more strategic than Dr. Hartwell. She maintained the appearance of cooperation with government programs while secretly developing independent research capabilities that couldn't be compromised by external oversight. Her archived materials represent decades of consciousness research that was conducted entirely outside official channels. Alex's excitement was evident as she absorbed the implications of Chen's approach to protecting consciousness research from institutional interference. So, Doctor, Chen's archives contain not just theoretical foundations, but practical applications that were developed without government oversight or corporate influence. Whitmore confirmed Alex's understanding with a nod. Dr. Chen believed that consciousness field technology should only be developed under conditions that guaranteed ethical application and prevented misuse by organizations with authoritarian objectives. Her research represents the only comprehensive body of consciousness field knowledge that remains independent of institutional control. Margaret realized that their investigation had uncovered something far more significant than historical curiosity about a missing physicist. Chen's archived research represented a complete alternative to the consciousness technology that had been developed for surveillance and control purposes, offering possibilities for applications that could benefit humanity rather than enabling oppression. Dr. Whitmore, if Dr. Chen's research provides ethical alternatives to weaponized consciousness technology, do we have an obligation to make her discoveries available to researchers who could develop beneficial applications? Whitmore considered Margaret's question carefully before responding. Dr. Chen established specific criteria for determining when consciousness field technology could be safely shared with broader research communities. She believed that premature disclosure could lead to the same kind of institutional capture that had corrupted government-sponsored consciousness research. Alex pulled out a folder containing photocopies of Chen's ethical guidelines for consciousness research disclosure, materials that she and Margaret had studied extensively during their investigation. We've reviewed Dr. Chen's criteria and we think current conditions might be favorable for beginning careful disclosure of consciousness field theory to trusted researchers. Whitmore examined Chen's guidelines, noting the careful attention to preventing institutional capture while enabling beneficial research that could serve human welfare rather than organizational power structures. Dr. Chen's criteria are sound, but implementing them will require extraordinary caution and sophisticated understanding of how to build research networks that can resist co-optation by hostile organizations. Margaret leaned forward, sensing that they were approaching the crucial moment when Whitmore would either agree to help them continue their investigation or recommend that they abandon consciousness research to avoid the dangers that had destroyed Hartwell's career. Dr. Whitmore, will you help us develop an approach to consciousness research that honors Dr. Chen's ethical principles while advancing human understanding of consciousness field phenomena? Whitmore was silent for several minutes, apparently weighing the risks of becoming involved with research that had proven dangerous for previous investigators. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent decades regretting missed opportunities to take principled stands against institutional corruption. Dr. Chen, Alex, I spent 40 years watching consciousness research be perverted for surveillance and control applications while therapeutic and enhancement possibilities were ignored or suppressed. If there's a chance to develop consciousness field technology according to ethical principles that prioritize human welfare, then I believe we have an obligation to pursue that opportunity despite the risks involved. Alex's face lit up with excitement at Whitmore's agreement to join their investigation. Dr. Whitmore, what do you think our first step should be? How do we begin building a research network that can advance consciousness field theory without attracting attention from organizations that prefer to keep this knowledge secret. Whitmore pulled out a small notebook and began writing names and contact information for researchers who might be willing to participate in ethically oriented consciousness research. We'll need to start very carefully, reaching out to people who have demonstrated both scientific competence and ethical integrity. The network will need to include not just consciousness researchers, but also experts in information security, legal protection, and organizational design. Margaret watched Whitmore compile a list of potential collaborators, noting names that she recognized from various fields related to consciousness research, cybersecurity, and civil liberties advocacy. The diversity of expertise that Whitmore considered necessary suggested the complexity of challenges they would face in developing consciousness research capabilities that could resist institutional capture. Dr. Whitmore, how do we approach these researchers without immediately revealing the full scope of what we've discovered? We need to establish trust and credibility before we can share sensitive information about Hartwell's fate and Chen's hidden research. Whitmore finished writing and handed the list to Margaret. We'll start with theoretical discussions that don't mention historical controversies or classified applications. Once we establish scientific credibility and ethical compatibility, we can gradually reveal additional information to researchers who demonstrate genuine commitment to beneficial consciousness research. Alex studied the list of potential collaborators, noting institutional affiliations that spanned multiple universities, research organizations, and advocacy groups. Dr. Whitmore, some of these people work for organizations that might have connections to government consciousness research programs. How do we ensure that information about our network doesn't reach people who might want to interfere with ethical consciousness research? Whitmore's expression grew serious as she considered Alex's concern about operational security. We'll implement the same kinds of compartmentalized communication protocols that Dr. Chen developed for protecting her research. Each collaborator will only have access to information that's necessary for their specific contributions, and sensitive materials will be distributed through secure channels that prevent unauthorized access. Margaret realized that they were planning to establish what amounted to a covert research organization dedicated to developing consciousness field technology according to ethical principles that prioritized human welfare over institutional power. The scope and complexity of such an undertaking exceeded anything she had anticipated when she first agreed to help Alex investigate Hartwell's disappearance. Dr. Whitmore, what you're describing will require resources, coordination, and security, measures that go far beyond normal academic research. Are we prepared for the level of commitment and risk that ethical consciousness research will require? Whitmore met Margaret's gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had spent decades working under challenging conditions. Dr. Chen, consciousness field technology represents one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs in human history. If we don't take responsibility for ensuring its ethical development, then we're abandoning that responsibility to organizations that have already demonstrated their willingness to use consciousness research for harmful purposes. Alex nodded emphatically, showing no hesitation about committing to the demanding and potentially dangerous work that lay ahead. Dr. Whitmore is right. We can't just study Dr. Hartwell's and Dr. Chen's discoveries as historical curiosities. We have to take responsibility for making sure consciousness field technology is developed in ways that benefit humanity rather than enabling oppression. Margaret felt the weight of decisions settling around her as she contemplated the path that Whitmore and Alex were proposing. Committing to ethical consciousness research would require abandoning the safety and predictability of conventional academic life in favor of work that carried both extraordinary promise and significant risk. But Margaret also understood that their investigation had already moved far beyond academic research into territory where moral obligations transcended professional considerations. Having gained access to knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness and reality, they faced choices that would determine whether that knowledge served human welfare or institutional power. "All right," Margaret said, quietly. "Let's begin building a network for ethical consciousness research. But we'll need to be extremely careful about operational security, and we'll need to be prepared to protect ourselves and our collaborators if our work attracts hostile attention." Whitmore smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun, an expression that transformed her serious features and revealed the enthusiasm that had originally drawn her to consciousness research decades earlier. "Dr. Chen, Alex, what we're undertaking will be difficult and demanding, but it may also be the most important work any of us ever do. Consciousness field technology could transform human civilization if it's developed according to ethical principles that prioritize truth and human welfare." Alex gathered the materials they had brought to share with Whitmore, organizing documents and research summaries with the careful attention to security that had characterized all of her investigation activities. "Dr. Whitmore, how soon can we begin reaching out to potential collaborators? I'm excited to start building a research network that can finally bring Dr. Chen's work into open scientific inquiry." Whitmore checked her watch and glanced around the coffee shop, noting that their conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours and that the venue was beginning to empty as afternoon gave way to evening. "We should start immediately, but we'll need to be methodical about our approach. Each contact will require careful preparation and assessment before we reveal any sensitive information." Margaret stood to shake hands with Whitmore, feeling both excitement and apprehension about the commitment they had made to continue consciousness research under conditions that would challenge everything she understood about academic work. "Dr. Whitmore, thank you for sharing your knowledge and agreeing to help us develop ethical approaches to consciousness field research. This collaboration could indeed transform our understanding of human potential and the nature of reality itself." Whitmore gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, but paused to address both Margaret and Alex with an expression that conveyed both encouragement and warning. "Dr. Chen, Alex, remember that consciousness research has been suppressed for decades by organizations with significant resources and strong motivations for maintaining control over this technology. Success will require not only scientific brilliance, but also strategic wisdom and operational security that protects everyone involved in our network." Alex nodded solemnly, understanding the seriousness of Whitmore's warning while maintaining the determined enthusiasm that had driven months of independent research into dangerous historical mysteries. "We understand the risks, Dr. Whitmore, but we also understand that consciousness field technology represents knowledge that could help humanity transcend limitations that have constrained human potential for centuries." As Whitmore left the coffee shop, Margaret and Alex remained at their table for several additional minutes, processing the implications of what they had learned and the commitments they had made. Their investigation had evolved from academic curiosity about a historical mystery into active participation in efforts to develop revolutionary technology according to ethical principles that challenged powerful institutional interests. Margaret looked at Alex, seeing in the child's determined expression the same intellectual courage that had driven Hartwell and Chen to pursue dangerous knowledge despite extraordinary risks. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate work of building a research network capable of advancing consciousness field theory while protecting itself from organizations that preferred to keep such knowledge secret. But tonight, Margaret found herself both exhilarated and terrified by the realization that their small investigation had uncovered possibilities that could indeed change the world, if they possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to navigate the challenges that lay ahead. The conversation with Whitmore had confirmed that consciousness field technology represented real, practical knowledge with revolutionary implications for human civilization. Whether their efforts to develop that technology according to ethical principles would succeed, or whether they would face the same fate that had befallen Hartwell, remained to be seen. But Margaret understood that having gained access to such knowledge, they faced moral obligations that transcended personal safety and professional convenience. As they finally prepared to leave the coffee shop, Alex turned to Margaret with an expression that combined excitement with the gravity of someone who fully understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. Dr. Chen, I know this is much more complicated and dangerous than either of us anticipated when we started investigating Dr. Hartwell's disappearance. But I think we're doing something that could help humanity in ways that we can't even imagine yet. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders as she contemplated the work that lay ahead. Alex, you're right that this is more than we anticipated. But you're also right that consciousness field technology represents possibilities for human advancement that justify extraordinary efforts and risks. Let's see if we can succeed where Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Chen faced obstacles that they couldn't overcome on their own. Bito. As they walked out into the Boston evening, Margaret and Alex carried with them not only the weight of revolutionary knowledge, but also the hope that their generation might finally be ready to develop consciousness field technology according to principles that served human welfare rather than institutional power. The real test of their courage and wisdom was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.